Hello, everyone, and welcome back to This Week in Enterprise Tech. I'm Hyoun Park from Amalgam Insights, joined as always by Charlie Araujo. How are you today?
I am great. Although I have to admit, I've been watching some of our recent podcasts lately, and I've realized that my what I think is a neutral face when I just sort of sit here and I'm not smiling, I'm not doing anything. Actually, I look like I'm angry all the time. So I'm trying very hard today. You guys gonna tell me how I'm doing? Trying to smile more so that it's very obvious. Because otherwise, my neutral is just like I look mean. So yes, but otherwise I'm doing. So in case you're wondering, I am doing good. Even if I sometimes sit here and look dour, I'm doing good.
Well, we live in a very polarized world, lots of things that can make you angry. So, you can be as angry as you want, but you're not, but you're not. But it's been an interesting week in tech. We've seen a number of announcements from some of the big tech companies, ranging from Microsoft to SAP to Intel, that we're going to at least chat about a little bit. But we're also seeing some predictions and announcements made by other analyst firms that have been announcing some of their recent research. One of the ones that got my attention to start with was Gartner coming out with both a press release and a note basically saying 30% of generative AI projects will be basically canceled after the proof of concept. Basically, they are starting to realize that generative AI projects are sometimes half-baked and will be abandoned as companies are starting to figure out the reality of what they need to do.
Well, first of all, you're on your own this week. I'm just going to sit and listen because I spent all week just watching the Olympics. So I really have no idea that there was any news going on whatsoever. No, just playing on that. I wish I actually had. I finally got to watch some of it this weekend and thoroughly enjoyed it and got into it a lot. But okay, so Gartner, as usual. This is if I was a marketing guy, I would make this their tagline. It's like we state the obvious and act like it's groundbreaking analysis. It's like, welcome to the party, pals. Yeah,
Mm-hmm.
we've been talking about this for a long time that these Gen AI projects are in for some rough goes. We're going to talk about some additional reporting that we're seeing right now, reinforcing that. Um, and I think almost shocking insofar as um, one of the clear indicators is how long it takes any of this stuff to come to fruition. And we have this, as we've talked about, this massive mismatch between the speed of innovation and the sort of explosion of innovation, particularly around generative AI, and the relatively glacial pace of deployment within any enterprise for any technology. And so this is one of those where we got a whole lot of bell ringing that happened, a whole lot of people doing proof of concepts, a whole lot of people throwing money at things to show like that they're moving forward. Um, but that when you start weighing this against actual cost and value, it's can be very difficult to justify across a whole number of dimensions, particularly when you just look at how many irons are in the fire for a typical CIO or an enterprise IT organization today. So I think the 30%, only 30% is, would actually be a good thing if 70% of POCs moved forward. I think in this day and age, with as truly experimental as it still is, I think that would actually be positive. But my last little comment on this, and the only thing I found in this report that was truly like not head scratching, like what are they thinking, like made me think, was the numbers that they Gartner are assigning in terms of cost to these projects, like staggering numbers on so they break down like a table, and if you look at the report or the press release
Mm-hmm.
of the different approaches, and like even when they're saying that you modify an existing LLM and like tune it to your needs, they're estimating a cost of 8 to 11,000 per user per year. That is a staggering cost. I don't know where they got the
Yes.
number. If that's anywhere close to true, no one's ever going to do any of this. I mean, that is just shockingly big numbers that they are estimating. And that was the only thing that was surprising to me in this report, because if those numbers are true, if that's really what this is costing, then the hill to climb to an ROI and a return on these AI investments for an enterprise is substantially higher than I was thinking.
Yeah, so we're going to talk about this a bit later about how even trying to justify $20 or $30 a month per employee is tough. But if the actual number is $1,000 per month, you've got to have some real value that is very easy to articulate and very easy to turn into a dollar sign to justify any sort of investment along those lines. And it's not a secret that if you are trying to do generative AI and customize it to your company in any ways, it quickly becomes $1 million investment. That's just the cost of talent plus compute plus testing plus all the data wrangling that goes on. That's just the reality. But 30% seems such a low percentage to me, because we've talked about the data science world for some time now, where it is very common for 80 to 90% of proof of concepts to not move forward into production. And honestly, part of that is the experimental process of figuring out whether something should work. You should have a failure rate when you are working with new technologies and figure out at the proof of concept level that something's not going to go on. That is actually not a failure of the process to say that only half
Yeah.
of projects end up going through. In fact, it's better if you cut it off at that proof of concept phase rather than spend additional millions of dollars trying to push into production when you shouldn't be. So I don't think that 30% or 50% or even higher is necessarily bad. I just think that setting 30% as the line seems extremely conservative and almost it's like a no-brainer. Like, it's like saying that hitters will miss the ball 30% of the time when you have a 300 batting average. 30% is your average hit rate. Like, you're going to miss 70% of the time. That's the reality. And probably AI is kind of like baseball in that regard, that your good batting average might be 300, 30% that's your
Well, I mean,
success.
yeah, I mean, I did find it interesting. This article sort of positioned this like a bad thing, like, oh my gosh, how horrible that we're only going to see a 30%, or we're going to see 30% of these fail. And it is, I do find that shocking because, like like we talked about, because of the experimental nature of this, it should be higher. If it's not higher, then you're playing it way too safe with a technology that demands testing and experimentation and putting it out there and seeing what happens. And so, I think there, again, so many things are misguided around this and sort of how they're looking at it, I think. But, going back to the price part for me, so they have this table that talks about the various use cases, and I guess they're considering the different approaches. So they have everything from like a commercial Gen AI app on the low end side to building your own custom models from scratch at the sort of high end. And you mentioned $1 million, and calling a spade for a large enterprise, $1 million is not a big investment. We've talked about these numbers. We talked about Databricks and Snowflake talking about $10 million to build an LLM, and we're going, that's not that much money for these big companies. So that's not the number that shocked me when they're looking at these upfront costs, which all range from 100,000 to as much as 20 million for these big custom models. But in that context, we're talking about a custom model that is now built for a very specific use case that ostensibly is driving a tremendous amount of organizational value. But then when they put this recurring per user per year cost and for the custom models, they're saying $11,000 to $21,000 per user per year. Those are just shockingly big numbers. And so now when you start replicating, who knows exactly how they're defining a user in that context, but that makes this arguably prohibitive across any dimension. And so like I said, I'm really curious where they came up with those numbers. And I think this is, if I'm a CIO reading this report, the big aha for me is I need to dig very deep into my cost structures as I look at these projects to truly understand that ROI, that potential. Because if we see these kind of cost overruns, and they're talking on a an exponential factor to what we saw with cloud, and we saw what happened with cloud, where people weren't going in their eyes wide open and could get themselves in a whole ton of trouble with crazy cost overruns with cloud. AI, it looks like it could be 10 times worse if these numbers are anywhere close.
Right. And for me, I think from a common sense perspective, there are probably three big buckets that I would be most concerned about. The first is around data. How quickly do you need to bring in new data, update it, change it, put in the metadata, all of that good stuff. The second is around the model itself and how often it needs to be updated and fine-tuned on a year-to-year basis to continue getting good results. And then probably the third is around UX, how quickly the job itself changes. And all three of these need to be taken into account pretty seriously. And there's some other subsidiary things around training and the additional talent you might need. But I think of kind of data, model, UX, all as being three categories, that could have a lot of cost potentially, depending on the rate of change that exists in your company. And yes, that can be extremely prohibitive because just thinking about 10K per person, any large enterprise has 5K, 10K, 20K, 50K people. That becomes a wild amount of money to start spending
Yeah,
on AI.
crazy. And I think the stakes are getting high and getting real in that we are reaching this point where people are starting to get things into production, and the results maybe aren't great. So there's a Business Insider article talking, and they didn't name them, I think for obvious reasons, but a CIO of, quote, a very large pharma company signed up with Microsoft for their Copilot product. So this is the productivity based Copilots, so within the Office suite, at $30 per person extra, which represented, according to this article, approximately double what they were paying. They deployed it for 500 employees, which isn't a large number. So I don't know if this was a test or maybe this was one of these proof of concepts. But basically, this was, put it on a measure of roughly $180,000 in additional cost per year. Again, for a large company, that's not a lot of money. And the CIO canceled this contract because could not justify or prove anything remotely close to an ROI on this. And I think that it's indicative. When we've heard versions of this and we've been talking about it, I know certainly off the record, I've heard a number of CIOs express dismaying concern over the price and how they can possibly justify a productivity uplift or demonstrate a productivity uplift enough to justify that cost. And so I think this stuff is starting to get real. And on a related note around it, the Wall Street Journal was reporting that Microsoft in their annual report has now added OpenAI to their list of competitors, which we've also talked about, where, so on the one hand, I feel like, I think all of them are sort of getting pinched. Again, we've been talking about this for a while. On the one hand, you got this incredibly competitive landscape. On the other hand, you have the customers who are supposed to be funding all these, paying for all these investments, the repayment of it, and they're all struggling to find a return. And so it's could be a very interesting sort of perfect storm moment.
Yeah, that ROI of copilots is interesting because we talk about how it should be easy to calculate how much you get back. So if it costs $30 a month and you have an employee who's making $60 an hour, the easy math to do is to say, well, 30 divided by 60, that's half. So if you get a half hour of productivity, then it pays for itself. But that's not actually true for a variety of reasons. First of all, there's just the overhead associated with a person, the plant, the office, the everything else associated with payroll. But the more important thing is that most companies actually think about the revenue per employee that they're making because you're trying to be profitable. So honestly, if you're paying somebody $60 an hour, you should be making $70 an hour off of them, $80 an hour, $100 an hour, whatever it takes to pay for that employee plus the margin that the company makes. And that's the actual productivity that you're looking for. So if you're somebody's making $60 an hour, you might have to find, call it 120 or 150 or $200 of actual value to put into place. So the first thing is, if you're looking for a half hour productivity and you measure it, but people's lives don't seem to be more productive, part of the reason is they're not actually getting the amount of value it takes to get that ROI back. But I think the more important part is people are doing a lousy job of being able to document value in general. So whether it's a half hour or 2 hours or 5 hours, people aren't able to actually figure out how many hours they are saving from the Copilot, or they don't believe the numbers that they are seeing, and it makes it hard to renew when you don't know or don't trust that ROI at the end of the day. So there's these real value issues that we have right now with AI.
Well, and we've talked about this. The whole productivity based ROI that most technology in the enterprise is based on has always been a red herring, because you don't actually realize that productivity savings unless you're going to actually reduce headcount and lay people off, which most cases doesn't happen. So the only way you can actually realize it, to your point, is that increase in productivity translates into increased revenue, right? That I'm actually therefore driving, and that becomes much harder to measure. And absent that measurement, all it looks like is going back to this pharma companies, all it looks like is I've increased my cost by $180,000, and what did I get for it? And it's very, very difficult to connect those dots, particularly when the productivity gains are coming in. I'm producing my PowerPoints faster, or I'm producing my Word documents faster, or whatever. And that's really hard. And that's why I'm becoming more and more convinced that those are going to become, and Microsoft is going to hate to hear this, but I believe that these are going to become baked in components they're not going to be able to charge for. They're going to get just baked into the normal cost of an Office subscription. And the things that people are going to pay for are going to be much more targeted and specific to a value creation model in some way, because it's the only way you can justify that sort of a large expense. So I think it's these are some interesting times as this is all shaking out, and we're seeing it evolve. And I think that also lays kind of the foundation of where's all this going, right? And it leads to another article that I found, I think, from a venture capital firm called Emergence. I think that's what their venture investment group of some sort. And they wrote an article about the AI plateau is real, and this is the next breakthrough. And we've been talking a lot about some of the challenges with Gen AI and transformer-based models and LLMs. And we talked a lot about that the next to break through this data plateau is going to require things like vision and audio and other modalities of context. And what's interesting is their whole premise is that the actual untapped space to generate this value is enterprise-based text, right? I.e., the contracts and on all the sort of proprietary internal enterprise data that is going to allow these models to sort of go to the next level. And I think it's interesting because if you look at the landscape, not to pick on Microsoft, but you go back and look at the Copilot, they're not trying to do any of that, right? This is really homogenized, generic sort of stuff. And secondly, you have a whole host of companies all going out of their way to say, we're not going to vacuum up your proprietary enterprise data. And so, part of the last, and I'm really curious your take on this particular article because it's really long and sort of in depth, but they're basically where they sort of landed is that this next whatever evolution is actually going to take place within the enterprise, because the enterprise has to own the model, own the data to make this work. And that sort of goes back to what we're talking about. It's like, where is this value realization going to come from? So what was your take on that particular perspective?
Yeah, I thought it was really interesting. A couple things got my attention here. First, that Emergence Capital, they invested in Zoom. They're very deep into collaboration as a topic of investment. And so they have to have models that they can trust, because the models that they are looking at are specifically to support the future of work and actual, we just dinged productivity, but they are trying to figure out what actually makes people more productive at the end of the day and they have gone pretty deeply into those solutions in their investment portfolio. So they have to care about not just what is the data, but what can you do with the data afterwards. Because they are going to be dealing with the Zoom-like or Slack-like or contact center-like outcomes, and they need to make those better, or else they are not going to make money. So I thought that it was interesting to see their approach of being able to not just figure out which data to use, but how to then contextualize that data and put that into some sort of workflow or process or activity that is core to the business. I thought that approach was good because it at least provides a level of maturity. And then Emergence Capital also pointed out that the AI itself will become commoditized over time. They called it S curves. In business school, we talk about these innovation cycles as well. So, whatever you want to call it, whether it's a S curves or the Schumpeter innovation cycle, we are going to see these waves that occur, where each wave goes, could be 12, 18, 24, 36 months. But eventually, everything we think is really amazing now is just going to be standard, just as you were saying about Microsoft having to accept that AI is going to be the help function and not an add-on that is going to be driving a lot of revenue over the long run.
Yeah, no, I think it's really interesting. I love folks like this that are obviously way smarter than me, and sort of them publishing the way they think about things. And I think that's really what's important is it's how they're thinking about this, and they identify these sort of four opportunities of where to go next and how to harness this enterprise data. And I'm not going to go through all of them, but what struck me is that it's really about specialized knowledge. So they have four, I'll just list them. They have four categories, I guess, of solving the plateau, these opportunities. They say one is to engage experts, second is to leverage latent data, the third is to capture in context, and the fourth is to secure the secret sauce. So how do you take advantage of this evolution of where this is going? But if I translate that, right, it's about harnessing the data, identifying the context of that data, and applying that context so that we can create value from it, having specific domain expertise, and the last, of course, is this idea of securing it. And what's really, really fascinating to me is they list a whole bunch of companies, and I mean, I'm hoping they're not, these are all companies they've invested in, but they list all these companies. And what is really notable is how few of these I'd even heard of, right? There's this whole host of companies that are sort of operating below the radar as sort of what they're saying as part of this next wave. And so, again, I look at this. What is CIO's perspective is that we need to not spend all of our energy focusing on the Anthropics and the OpenAIs and then fighting these big giant wars on big massive LLMs, and instead be really focusing on how you're going to apply this, how you're going to leverage this to create value, and how you're going to harness your own data in a way to combine with all of this. Going all the way back to the Gartner thing a minute ago, is you need to break that cycle. And I'm not the POC part of it necessarily, but if you're going to be having those kind of costs, if those costs are real, then the only way you're going to have any chance of justifying them is by having this sort of value creation model, because it's being leveraging in concert with your proprietary data. And so I love these sort of points of view, because they just cause me to kind of step back and question some of my own paradigms.
Yeah. And it seems that although something like ChatGPT is obviously extremely popular, it hasn't completely become ubiquitous in the way that AI would need to be to live up to the hype. And in that regard, I find it interesting when other established vendors start talking about AI to a greater degree. So, of course, we've been talking about OpenAI, Anthropic, Cohere, Microsoft, and they've all been doing a lot of interesting things in AI. But when the older companies start coming into AI and start having some sort of governance compliance that makes sense, that always is important from a practical perspective now as well. And it looks like Apple is starting to come into this, come into the game, come into the theater to a greater extent in actually trying to define what responsible AI means, as well as putting out its own 3 billion parameter model, which, models are models, but Apple probably has a better chance of actually building a small model that becomes extremely popular than everyone else, just because of what they do from an ecosystem perspective.
Yeah, so I mean, I think if you're an enterprise leader, it's hard to look at Apple and, obviously they play a role because a lot of your knowledge workers are going to have Apple products, but they're not generally considered a major enterprise player in the normal way. But I think what they do, there's a couple of things that I think that are significant about what they're doing. First of all, even the way they're approaching this announcement. So they made the announcement of Apple Intelligence, and now they're starting to, and there were some early releases if people were following it and with patent offices and stuff where they're releasing like research. But Now they're starting to trickle out before this is officially out yet, and they're starting to explain and peel back the covers on what they're doing. And so we're getting greater levels of exposure to their approach. And the first level at that level, what we're seeing is they are providing more than just lip service. They're truly attempting to find this balance, and they're in a very unique position because they control so much of our contextual data for those of us that are in the Apple ecosystem. Because I mean, if I think of Apple, right, I literally, my entire world, at least my online world, revolves around three devices: my MacBook, my iPad, and my iPhone. So they have literal access to all of that to provide the sort of contextual layer that they can apply AI to. But that creepy factor, that line is really, really deep, right? They have to demonstrate that they're doing this in a way that doesn't violate my sense of trust and privacy. And that is a very challenging thing for them to do. But if and as they nail that, because I believe they're going to, it's going to reset the standard for the enterprise, because us same knowledge workers that have these devices, much like the iPhone changed our perception of how we expected to interact with our technology in the office, this is going to change our perspective of how we interact with AI in the office. And to your point, the reality is that the vast majority of people, even tech savvy knowledge workers, still have at best dabbled with AI. They're not you and me. They're not people that are using this on a daily basis. And so I think Apple's release of this has the potential to really change that. The one thing that may hold it back is, at least right now, the word is that it's only going to be available on their newest phones, and so that may hold it back a bit. But I think this is going to be impactful. I think it's going to be cause a bit of a reckoning for CIOs, that it's going to cause a very dramatic shift in expectations.
I'm curious how Apple will actually be supporting AI in the long run, as Apple always ends up setting standards to such an extent that it becomes taken for granted. And I think a lot of people look at it, Apple, and say, well, they don't innovate anymore. When I feel like what they're actually doing is they are creating new ecosystem standards that become so assumed as normal standards that we take it for granted that some of these things that we are looking at and just using are only a year or two old, and we feel like we've been doing it forever just because Apple includes it so seamlessly into what people have been doing in the past. And even when they have products that I would say are not market leaders or haven't completely caught on, people don't doubt the quality of what they do for the most part. Say with something like an Apple TV, you might not love their content, might not be the most popular content overall, but everybody looks at their shows and says, hey, they're doing a decent job and we know how to buy it on our phone, etc. You could look across their entire portfolio, kind of with the exception of Siri. So I hope that Siri gets a bit of an upgrade as Apple starts figuring out AI to a greater extent.
Like, Apple's definitely not perfect. I think they have plenty of misses. I think their big thing, and frankly, they've never, maybe not never, but not for a very long time, have they been a true innovator. What they've always, people kind of bash the term fast follower, mostly because they translate that to mean like copycat. But Apple is the definition of the ultimate fast follower. But because what they do isn't the bleeding edge. They wait for something to be basically proven in the market, and then they refine it and make it so elegant that people actually adopt it, that to help it cross that transom into I forgot what the term is now, right? But where you get this broad acceptance, right? And that's the real genius. And that's what I think they have the potential of doing with AI, particularly within the enterprise context, of truly changing that. I mean, going all the way back to the story about the CIO, I mean, I've used the Microsoft versions of this, and it doesn't surprise me that they ran into that. But I also think it's as much a challenge with a lack of imagination, and the fact that in order to truly see these benefits, you have to sort of break the paradigms of how we've historically worked. And I think that's what Apple has the potential of truly changing here. And what's interesting, if you watch some of the Microsoft ads, they clearly understand this, right? They get, like, if you watch how people interact with the AI in their ads, in the videos that they have, you see people are that is a representative of a change in paradigm. What I think is the gap is that when it gets deployed into production someplace right now, it's just a little glowing button and no one's training people on how to do it. We're not actually driving that organizational change aspect of it. And I think that's the real issue. And what I think Apple's brilliance has always been is they almost I wish I could figure out how to bottle it, but it's like they end up creating an interface that is so intuitive that it drives organizational change itself, that people intrinsically sort of understand how to use it, and that leads them to doing things differently. And that's been their brilliance. And if they can pull that off with AI, and what I've seen so far leads me to think that they will, and I do think it's going to be driven by a much improved Siri, thank goodness. I think it can have it may have a dramatic impact.
Yes. I can buy that. I do wonder how much we will be able to understand what Apple is doing from an AI perspective, as we've talked about responsible AI, ethical AI, having visibility to models, and Apple tends to be pretty opaque about how they do things. They like to be a black box for a bunch of reasons. One of it, the most important ones from a governance perspective, is if you give too much information, it becomes a security risk and it becomes easier to hack into. And Apple obviously doesn't want that. But at the same time, they've got to find that balance right now of how to provide trusted AI services, but at the same time, you're dealing with everything from the hype makers like OpenAI, as well as the open source solutions that are coming out of the likes of Meta and others. So there's a lot of balancing to do.
No doubt, no doubt. I think it's still early days, and they're clearly not the only one, obviously playing, and not even the only one playing at a consumer level. I mean, clearly Meta has theirs, and I know I'm starting to find some value. Interesting. So LinkedIn, right, a Microsoft company, I'm pretty sure it's theirs, that I'm finding that they're now providing summaries of like threads, and I'm finding that super useful. So I mean, I think we're going to see it's certainly not just Apple, right? We're going to see a lot of this in our sort of everyday lives, sort of popping up, and it's going to start reprogramming our brain of how we think things should operate. And but I do think just because of Apple's position and their ubiquity, and to your point, the closed nature of their ecosystem, in which they can, because they have so much control, they can drive so much more change. I think it will be very impactful around it. But
Yeah.
there's also plenty of other news, and I really am curious your take on this particular. Well, two related, I guess, sort of related. The first is there is some news about cloud market growth, and what maybe is most surprising is how unsurprising it is. Basically, it's sort of, me, I like quoting my rom-coms in Hitch at the opening, when I forgot the rich girl's name, but she looks and says, yeah, I looked at the numbers and I'm still rich. And it's sort of like that's what it looks like with the cloud. It's like, we looked at the numbers and it's still growing. It's like the same story we've been seeing for a decade now. And then on sort of the complete flip side, mostly just because of its apparent challenge with adapting to this, is SAP had some big news on their executive board, which we haven't been able to make heads or tails of. So I'm curious your take on these two seemingly unrelated pieces, but how they may be kind of related to the same thing.
Yeah. First of all, the Synergy research group finding that enterprise cloud spend is up 22% year over year. I found that interesting because, frankly, that's still a very high rate of growth. Anybody who's ever tried to grow a company 20% year over year knows just how hard it is to maintain that level of top line growth. So the fact that an entire market is still growing that fast at the size that the cloud is currently at, they are estimating $79 billion. I think it's a little less than that, honestly, on a quarterly basis. But that we're just we're quibbling here at a time when obviously this is probably a $300 billion annual run rate market that is still growing 22% a year. And the biggest reason is obviously Amazon, Microsoft, and Google. which are all seeing big increases in investment despite all of the doubts that might be coming into play and all of the fistfights and knocking of heads they have going against each other. At the end of the day, this is a rising tide. All boats are floating upwards, and we're even seeing obviously Oracle starting to come in as a fourth hyperscaler, increasingly coming into play in competitive discussions because of both their established nature as an enterprise vendor, as well as the cost associated with what they are providing. So I find that interesting that this growth is continuing. Obviously, it's been pushed a lot by AI and the interest in experimentation, but also the realization that it is easier and easier to understand how to make enterprise IT work in the cloud. So on the one hand, there's this immense demand still for cloud computing that seems to grow unabated over time.
Well, so there are two big observations that I had with this. The first, beyond the obvious, like, well, yeah, it's still growing. But the fact is that what is, I think, somewhat obscured in this data is that we are seeing, at least anecdotally, I'm certainly seeing a lot of CIOs talking about repatriating workloads, and I think that is happening. I definitely think we are seeing that. But you see this increase because what is not accounted for in this, or what is not as easy to suss out, is that what we are seeing is just an overall growth in workloads, right? The amount of things we've automated, the amount of things we're now running is growing. And I think that's why this number is so high. I think, yes, we still have migrations happening. Yes, I think we're going to continue to see that. I think, I do firmly believe that the days of running your own data center are long past us. All of that, I think, is true. But I think a lot of this is being driven by the fact that there is just continued growth in the technology landscape, and that stack all the way around. The second big observation I had in this was the relative strength against Amazon. So Amazon is still clearly the market leader. So this study was looking at two things: the growth, but also the market share trends. And Amazon is basically flat, where the growth is coming to Microsoft and Google at the expense, interestingly enough, not so much of Amazon, but of everybody else. And one other little sidebar note, that they included Salesforce in this list, which I thought was interesting, because they're defining it as infrastructure as service, PaaS, and hosted private cloud. And I don't know that I put Salesforce into any of those categories, but that's a little sidebar. But I did find it interesting that as we've talked about in the past, we're seeing across a number of these sectors, cloud certainly included, where it is coming down to just the giants, and it's getting harder and harder for anybody, even other giants like Oracle and IBM, to really make any headway.
Right. I guess with Salesforce, you could look at maybe some of their data cloud or Heroku, or their application development capabilities, some AI stuff. I guess there's $1 billion in there. I mean, would Salesforce even notice, as big as they are at this point? But if they've got $1 billion or $2 billion in there, I guess they count in that cloud market share. But yeah, Amazon is starting to run into its ceiling. It feels like, from a market share perspective, and at this point, there's still a lot of opportunity for emerging vendors to make their mark in the cloud world because of this demand for compute. I'm amazed by the amount of data that is used for AI, and I know we all take this for granted, but making AI works requires an order of magnitude more data than your traditional analytic use cases did. And I find it stunning from an operational perspective, even as we can take it for granted as talking heads. So there's that happening on the one hand, but you also mentioned SAP. So big news happening with the SAP executive board, as they basically have released their chief revenue officer, Scott Russell, and their chief marketing officer, Julia White. And to me, that it feels like an odd move, just looking at it, that you would simultaneously get rid of your two top go-to-market officers. It definitely speaks to some, at least at the very least, not being very happy with your current go-to-market strategy and approach. I think that's pretty obvious. And from an operational perspective, I would think that if you are cutting off the head of your current go-to-market approach, that for the at least the short term, you are going to be pretty dependent on farming your base. And that is the big takeaway I would probably take away, that I would think about as an SAP customer at looking at this, that this is probably going to mean perhaps some additional pressure from your account managers, or additional focus on SAP products being pushed at you, perhaps even more than before, because I just don't understand how otherwise SAP will simply sell stuff. And maybe that's just a lack of imagination on my part.
Oh, I don't think so. I mean, I think I've told the story before on here that, used to run a lot of big executive dinners, and the rule I had is there are two words, we weren't allowed to say, and they were Oracle and SAP, right? The companies that we've long had these challenges with, in terms of just their acquisition processes and managing and working with them and all of that. And I think clearly they've struggled. They've struggled, going back to, the lead into this. This whole transition to the cloud has just not been kind to them. But I also think it's not just them. We're going to talk next in a second about Intel, and we've talked in the past about VMware, and we've talked about Oracle, and we sort of have this old guard collection of tech companies that are still incredibly, wealthy companies. They drive a lot of revenue still.
Mhm.
They will for the foreseeable future, but they are mostly just entrenched. Their revenue is driven by the lock-in factor, that it is incredibly expensive to displace them. They, in for the most part, are not being seen as providing the sort of strategic value, or in a strategic place, to the extent that it it is worth making the investment to replace them, and so they stick around. They're just
Mhm.
there. And so it ends up being this. And SAP, clearly in the days that Bill McDermott was there, they were clearly trying to break through that. They were clearly trying to find newfound relevance, and I thought we're doing some really good, interesting things. Um, but certainly over the last few years, I've been kind of not been paying attention to them, because they have just failed to really execute on that, failed to really get traction with S/4HANA, really get traction with getting people sort of over that hump to kind of break through, who they were. And I guess, I mean, the other big mystery for this is what we're referencing, and we'll put the link in the notes, an SAP press release. But this press release is 6 days old, and I'm finding zero news on this. So I don't know if this is just a big collective shrug of the market going, yeah, they weren't selling anything anyway, or I don't know.
Mhm.
It's bizarre. Or if we're misreading what this press release is saying, because it's also written in very weird, arcane sort of language, talking about resigning from the executive committee or executive board or whatever it was. And the whole thing is just very odd to me, but I think it just speaks to this sort of shift we're seeing around these sort of legacy old guard tech companies.
Yeah, and we saw that as well with Intel, which recently announced laying off 15,000 employees. Obviously, they've had a tough road in front of them ever since pretty much NVIDIA stole their lunch. But I think it makes sense when you look at Intel's what Intel announced. They said we're laying off 15,000 people because basically we have more employees now than we did in our heyday when we were making more money. So, that is very basic math. You have to you have to employ at the rate that you make money, and Intel is just not keeping up. But I think it also speaks to how we are seeing this fundamental changing of the guard right now, which is really hard to adjust to if you have had traditionally had millions of dollars associated with one vendor for decades. All of a sudden, this is a transitional period where you have to start shifting money pretty substantially in your portfolio, and simply making incremental changes is not necessarily a good move. You could easily be stuck with a dinosaur very quickly if you are not willing to go all in on the next generation of technologies and choose wisely.
Yeah, this one was hard for me for a few reasons. I think I of all of the sort of legacy players, like I'm pretty bearish on IBM, I'm pretty bearish on SAP, I'm pretty bearish on Oracle. I think they all have long runway and they're all trying and what have you. But I've always had sort of the soft spot in my heart for Intel. I think that they have for many years have tried to, they've been in a tough position. They were chip makers. They were, they did the whole Intel Inside to try to get named, but they were the behind the scenes. And in an era where for most of us, we just didn't think about chips. We just didn't care about it. It wasn't, a truly a driving factor in any way. But they still try to be very good, I would argue, industry citizens and invested a lot in the industry to educate and to help move things forward. And so I feel like they've done a lot of the right things. They've also been recipients, I believe, the largest recipient of funds from the CHIPS Act as part of this effort by the U.S. government to regain some control of chip manufacturing here in the U.S. And the hard part for Intel is that they were much like Google, much like others, sort of missed this ball. They didn't see the pitch coming. But the difference is with chips, the cycle time to get up to speed and start producing a new product is massively long. And so even with the help of the CHIPS Act, what this is a sign of, a recognition of, is that they are not going to be able to do a rapid pivot. There's no quick change here, and so they have to retrench and come out of it. Now, I have I have faith that I do believe that they're in a pretty good position to have a fighting chance to come back more so than many others. But they're going to be in for a rough road for a while, so it's definitely going to be a challenging time.
Yeah, I find the chip market fascinating in that I'm not just blowing smoke here. None of them are clients. None of them talk to me at all. But I think the CEOs at the chip companies are some of the smartest people in tech overall, whether it be Jensen Huang, AMD's Lisa Su, Intel's Pat Gelsinger. Like these are all people who are massively smart and understand tech markets extremely well. But Pat Gelsinger has a lot to a lot to fix, and honestly it has been a bloated company, but at the same time we are talking about one of the big innovators in supply chain in the United States, and one that has fundamentally driven the tech market, and probably what is good for Intel is good for the tech market as a whole. So hoping the best for them, but at the same time the chip market is hard, and we're seeing that not just with Intel but with a little company called NVIDIA that we've talked about once or twice. They just came out saying that their Blackwell chips are going to be delayed due to design flaws, and as you are probably noticing in your stock market portfolio, everybody everybody just responded to that. The Taiwanese stock market cratered on that announcement, and then everybody else kind of followed suit as the global stock market does. So it is hard to escape that announcement of what seems at first to be a relatively minor announcement of a delay in chip launch ends up being this global issue, which kind of speaks to how overheated the talk about AI is right now.
Yeah, I think it speaks more to how much was already priced into the NVIDIA stock price and how much has been a focus on that. I do think it's interesting going back to Intel for a second. I think their opportunity is the fact that, as we've talked about, I think we're going to see a reset AI overall in the efficiency and the productivity, as everyone has recognized they need to reduce power consumption and reduce or increase performance and throughput. And I think that may create an opportunity. I think we're already seeing it. AMD has made some moves recently around this, where Intel may not have to catch up, so to speak, with NVIDIA, and their most advanced chips to find a market, and that could provide an opening. So yeah, I think it's an interesting space. If I put my CIO hat on, I think I look at this with interest, and the big takeaways we talked about: chips do matter, so be paying attention. I also think while I think this was a gross overreaction to the NVIDIA news, I do think it should be a clear sign if you're a CIO that you should be hedging your bet. and looking to diversify, whether that's Intel, whether that's AMD, but having a few chips, so to speak, in multiple baskets is not a bad idea.
Yes, an AI chip supply will continue to be constrained for the near future. It's still going to be hard to get your hands on those, and we're going to see some interesting things happening with those companies that have been pooling and hoarding these chips, whether it be Meta or Tesla or Google or what have you.
Yeah, I forgot. I heard in that same report, Microsoft, I heard, was it number 180,000 of them? I think they were, geez, staggering
Mhm.
numbers. But part of it, what all of this speaks to, almost everything we talked about. I know we keep trying to have a day where we don't talk about nothing but AI, but this was not one of those days. And as we close out, there was my favorite news story of the week, going all the way back, talking about the Olympics, is that Google and their Gemini Gen AI product gotten in some hot water for they've been running this whole series of ads, which overall I think have been really good. They were very contextual, and they sort of fit in, and positive and uplifting about the Olympics and how Gen AI might play a role. But they've had one particular ad where it was this man who was basically trying to, the storyline was his daughter and wanting to write a letter to her idol, who was an Olympic star or what have you, and using Gemini to help write it, and just the internet, being the internet, blew up over this thing, going, what is this saying? And it's and you seem to have a different reaction. I thought it was like a bunch of hype over nothing, and but Google pulled the ad, and so here we go again. But you had a different take, I think, right?
Yeah. So first of all, I'm very emotional about the Olympics. I'm a total Olympics fanboy. The star in question for the Google ad. So this Google ad was writing about a kid writing a fan letter to a star named Sydney McLaughlin-Levrone, who is the world record holder in the women's 400-meter hurdles. Like, I could go into great detail on this, but suffice it to say, she is a amazing athlete, totally deserving of fan letters all day long, totally changing the game. But this ad showed how this kid was using AI to write the fan letter. And to me, it just felt like, as a kid, not using your own words or not asking your parents for help and going straight to the AI, it just felt a little inhuman to me. And I guess maybe this is where I'm finding out that I'm old and almost dead. Yeah, I'm a Luddite at this point, but there's a piece of me that said, oh, I wanted to see that kid figure it out with their own words, come from the heart instead of coming from Gemini. Yeah.
It's fair. It is fair. I mean, if I put my father hat on, and if my daughter wanted to write this letter, I would absolutely tell her, go pull out a piece of paper, and or maybe pull out the computer, and just write what you feel. I get that. Now, in fairness, the ad did say it was the dad talking, and how the dad wanted to help, and said, I'm good with words, but this needs to be perfect, kind of an idea, and so I'm going to have it help me with my first draft. And look, at you can. To me, it's like, I think you can make the case either way about whether or not, if I was the father, would I use it or not. But I also just thought the reaction was so overwhelmingly overblown. It was like, hey, look, AI, no different than, I mean, because there are plenty. My wife is one of these, where it's like, if I were to tell our daughter, go forward a few years and say, hey, go type an email, she'd be like, no, pull out a pen and a piece of paper. You got to handwrite this thing, right? It's like every technology introduces that next sort of level of, it's like, well, should we use it or not? And at the end of the day, it's just technology. We use it however it makes sense. So I just found it ironic and sort of hilarious that there's just massive explosion over this. It's like, folks, it's an AI tool. B, it's an ad. It's like, get over it.
Yeah. Next up, though, is going to be 100 million form letters to Santa, all saying the exact same thing with the same format. coming from ChatGPT and Gemini. You know.
If my daughter uses AI to write some Python code to automate Santa writing letters, the theory that if she bombards Santa with 1,000 letters, she's more likely to get what she wants. I'm applauding this ingenuity. It's like use the technology and make yourself productive.
Hey, if they're taking that next step, that's something else.
Exactly. Well, there
Wow.
we go.
Okay, so here we are teaching the next generation how to take full advantage of generative AI, and Google taking a bit of a hit for that.
There we go.
Yeah, on that note, I guess we're going to call it a week. Thanks for joining us. It's been a wild week, and something tells me it's going to get a little bit even wilder as we get through the summer. But it was great to chat
Well,
with you. Yeah.
absolutely, and I hope you enjoy your final week of the Olympics. So enjoy it.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Thanks for joining us. Feel free to like, subscribe, comment, tell us what you liked, tell us what you didn't like, tell us what we should be covering for next week. And we look forward to chatting with you yet again next week. Take care.